All right, everybody, this is it. We got to you getting ready for big quiz number 2, and just a few things I want to remind you. Hopefully, this will be some help. You got those notes that I gave you, and hopefully, those are going to go a long way. Just some things that we had done before. That was mostly review. That is comparative advantage, the PPFs, and so you saw some of those problems on the practice big quiz. No surprise, you're going to see something like that on the big quiz there. Okay, so important thing there just to remember is the gains from trade and the terms of trade was a really important thing, so you could take a look at that. Also, we talked more about the sources of comparative advantage, why different individuals, cities, states, countries had the comparative advantages that they had. And then we transitioned from that and talked about how we went from barter, where those terms of trade were goods for goods, and we started talking about introducing money into the economy, foreign exchange markets. Remember, it's the reciprocal markets. So what's happening in one market's also affecting the other. And so remember, drawing both of those together, you had some good practice with that on the foreign exchange worksheet. So I'm not too worried about that. I think you guys are going to rock and roll that. The one thing, though, and this is one I talked about last week before I left, and also you see that on the foreign exchange worksheet key, is that if we have changes in interest rates or changes in the price level, those two things will cause shifts in both because they're relative. So that is to say, if the interest rate in Great Britain goes up and capital flows chase those high interest rates, we're going to have capital outflow from the United States, chasing after that higher interest rate. But even though the U.S. interest rate didn't change, it's relatively lower. So although we're going to have some capital outflow, there's also some of the British citizens who are going to keep some of their money at home. So we have a change in the capital inflows. So if you recall, we had those, and there was actually 2 shifts. Technically, that's right, but remember those shifts reinforced one another. So don't get caught up and confused about that, and if you forget, that's all right. It's a process, but I think we want to get the process. There's some points allocated to that, but if you can still get the right conclusion, then you're going to get most of those points. So just be careful in that analysis there. The other thing that we wanted to make sure we understood with capital inflow and capital outflow is being able to distinguish between what's the investing behavior and what is the saving behavior. That is, whether it's foreign portfolio investment, buying financial assets, which is savings, or if we're buying physical capital, which is a foreign direct investment. We're building a factory over there. Okay, so we just wanted to make that distinction. And then, of course, there's a video I put up about this. I just want to make sure is the balance of payments. On the video, I show how net exports equals net capital outflow. And that's the important concept of balance of payments. But a more traditional way to look at that is current account and capital account. Current account being effectively net exports, and capital account being the opposite of net capital outflow. It's KN, capital inflow, minus capital outflow. So now the equation is a little bit different because KA plus CA equals 0. Still the same idea, the balance of payments. In that case, if there's a current account deficit, there has to be a corresponding capital account surplus so that that comes into balance. Okay, so there's some discussion of that in the notes. The other thing I would remind you about, and you'll see this on the big quiz, is you got to remember some of those major exchange rates. Now, I know it changes from day to day, but in the notes, I gave you guys some exchange rates, and you have to have those precisely. No rounding. What I gave you in the notes, you have to know. And that just gives us a benchmark so that, later on in the future, you'll have a sense of what the exchange rate was at some point in time and whether there's been appreciation or depreciation of the currency. So that was what we did, and then we went from that to analyzing autarky situations and free trade, world trade. We specifically were focused on competitive world markets where a small country was a price taker, and so that's what we did is we did the world market and we pulled that price over, and you got a lot of practice at that. Recognized what the trade position was. Did that mean they were an importer or an exporter? Did they have a comparative advantage? PW is greater than PA. Then that means they had a comparative advantage in that good, and they became an exporter of that. But we also saw there was still some, when we were importing, we still had some domestic consumption. I'm sorry, some domestic production. That it wasn't a perfect specialization that sometimes with those early comparative advantage problems we tended to suggest. So make sure we understand how to illustrate those, and you've got some practice on those. But also at that point too, recognizing free trade, the welfare analysis, consumer surplus, producer surplus, recognizing that with free trade that the winners win more than the losers lose. That we now had some consumer surplus gains when we imported, and when we exported, there was an increase in producer surplus. But what the winners win was greater than what the losers lost when we went to free trade. So some people aren't going to be happy. They might use some political influence. So we talked about the politics of protectionism. We talked about how the costs or benefits to the producers are going to be more highly concentrated because there are a smaller number of producers, whereas costs and benefits that are that go to the consumers are going to be diffused. It's a small amount per person, even though the total is greater in total than what the producers might face. Okay, so that's something important to kind of think about in the terms of the politics. And then the arguments for protectionism, you guys went through those, and those are in the notes, so I'm not going to belabor that point. Just want to give you some heads up. One thing we didn't talk about, and I think this is something that you guys can do on your own, is we didn't talk about the international institutions much. If you guys get a chance, then maybe you could talk about those in class, but they're in your notes, and we just wanted to be able to recognize and understand what some of those different international institutions and what some of those different trade agreements that have been important trade agreements, what some of those are, and be able to recognize that. So later we can have some more in-depth discussion on that. And so those are the major things from the notes. Just flipping through the practice big quiz here, I'm really not seeing anything that's going to be trouble. I do want to say this. Remember we talked about having world trade and that there might be some changes because we know supply and demand, it's dynamic. They're changing over time. So there may be some problems like you saw on some of the worksheets and here in the practice big quiz where some event happens affecting the world supply or the world demand, which would change the world price. And then we would have to change the world price line that we've taken over to the small country and see how that changes their trade position. But we also might have some events that affect the domestic economy, not the world economy. Then we're going to shift the domestic supply or the domestic demand. That would change autarky, but not the world price. And then we would then look again and see how that changed their import position, or their import or export, their trade position. Okay, just glancing here, then we got the policies. Once there is some protectionism, what's going to happen and how do we analyze those in terms of a tariff and in terms of a quota. And so I think if you got some questions on those, there's another video on here about tariffs and then one about quotas, so you can kind of get some practice on that. I think that's about it. We talked about the balance of payments being an important thing, and there's the video on that. And if you look back at your foreign exchange market worksheet, remembering the concept of purchasing power parity and evaluating whether a currency is overvalued or undervalued. So that would be a nice little review for you. Other than that, I think you guys are set to go. I think if you work hard this week, big quiz number 2, not a problem. You guys have great scores. I'm looking forward to grading those. So good luck.